Before we begin, let me ask you something. What do you do when the most dangerous man on the planet looks at you and laughs? Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh, a real one, deep from the chest. The kind that fills a room and makes everyone else inside it shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to join in or look away. What do you do when that laugh is directed at you? Most people would shrink. Most people would look away. Most people would quietly tell themselves, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm in the wrong room. Maybe I should just go. But most people weren't Bruce Lee. The year is somewhere in the late 1960s. The details around this particular story have been passed down through whispers, through first-hand accounts of people who were there, through the kind of oral history that only survives because what happened was too extraordinary to forget, too impossible to dismiss, too real to let die quietly. The exact location changes depending on who tells it. The names of the witnesses shift slightly with every retelling. The specific words spoken drift and sharpen across decades of memory and legend. But the core of it, the moment itself, stays exactly the same every single time. Because this isn't just a story about a fight. This is a story about what happens when the world tells you that you're too small, too light, too quiet, too ordinary. And you prove, in 10 seconds or less, that size was never the point. That it was never going to be the point. That the people who thought it was the point were asking entirely the wrong question. Let's talk about Mike Tyson first. If you know anything about the history of combat sports, anything at all, you know the name, Iron Mike. The baddest man on the planet. A man who walked into arenas and made other professional fighters, trained killers, every single one of them, feel something that men like that are never supposed to feel, fear. Mike Tyson at his absolute peak wasn't just a boxer. He was something closer to a force of nature wrapped inside a human body. Barely 5 feet 10 inches tall, which is considered short by heavyweight standards, but built like something that was carved rather than simply born. His neck alone seemed to belong to a different species. His shoulders were wide enough to reshape a door frame just by passing through it. His hands, those famous, legendary fists, had ended careers, ended consciousness, ended the deep-rooted confidence of men who had spent their entire lives becoming formidable, dangerous, and feared. And he was fast. That's what the casual observer always forgets when they picture Tyson. They remember the power, which was real and absolute and deeply terrifying. But the speed? The speed was the thing that made the power impossible to survive. A punch you never see coming hits harder than any blow you can brace for, prepare for, or absorb with any kind of intention. And with Tyson, by the time your brain registered the movement, the fist had already arrived. The lights were already going out. He moved like something that had no right to exist inside a heavyweight body. Fluid, explosive, predatory. Patient in the specific way that only truly dangerous things can afford to be patient. Because they already know how it ends. And because of all of this, because of everything he was, and everything the world could plainly see that he was, Mike Tyson had opinions, strong ones, about strength, about what a real fighter looked like, about what made a man genuinely, unmistakably dangerous. And in his eyes, in the eyes of the room around him, Bruce Lee did not look like a fighter. Imagine the scene, a room full of serious people, fighters, trainers, men who had spent their lives inside gyms and dojos and rings, men who could read another person's body the way scholars read ancient text, instantly nor confidently, drawing conclusions that almost never turned out to be wrong. The kind of room where reputation arrived before you did, where your record mattered more than your name, where the way you carried yourself was a language every person present could translate without a single word being spoken. And then Bruce Lee walked in, 5 feet 7 inches tall, by some accounts, shorter. He weighed somewhere around 135 pounds, though those who knew him personally sometimes said even that number was generous. He wasn't wide. He wasn't imposing in the way that room had learned to expect. He didn't fill space the way the big men did, didn't announce himself physically, didn't project the kind of visible, obvious danger that the people in that room had been trained their entire careers to recognize and to respect. What he had was something else entirely, a stillness. A particular quietness in the way he moved, like every step was deliberate. Like he wasn't simply walking through a room so much as he was consciously choosing to occupy space within it. There was something in his eyes, alert and measuring and completely precise, but calm, unnervingly calm. Not the calm of a man who wasn't paying attention, the calm of a man who had already mapped every possible outcome in the room and found himself completely comfortable with all of them. You had to look closely to see it, and not everyone bothered to look closely. The laugh came from somewhere near the back of the room. Whether it belonged to Tyson himself or to someone in his circle, whether it was a single voice or the quiet, unspoken agreement of several, the laugh came, low, dismissive, carrying in it that particular brand of mockery that doesn't require words, because the words are already understood by everyone present. This guy? This is what all the conversation has been about. You could feel it move through the room like a current, that specific social contagion of amusement, where one person's dismissal gives every person around them permission to feel the same thing, to look at this lean, quiet, impossibly still man and reach the same easy conclusion. There's been a mistake. Someone sent the wrong invitation. Someone walked into the wrong room. Bruce Lee heard it. He always heard things like that. His entire life had been a collection of moments exactly like this one. Moments where someone looked at him and saw only the surface, and made the fatal mistake of believing the surface was the whole story. It had happened in the streets of Hong Kong when he was young and scrappy and burning with something he hadn't yet found the words to name. It had happened when he came to America, a young man with an impossible level of conviction, trying to share a philosophy of combat with a world that had very fixed, very rigid ideas about who martial arts belonged to and who was allowed to teach it and who deserved to be taken seriously. It had happened in gyms and tournaments and quiet rooms exactly like this one. Different faces every time, same dismissal, same low laughter, same unspoken judgment dressed up as confidence. He was used to it. But being used to something doesn't mean you look away from it. What happened in the seconds after that laugh is the part of this story that everyone who was present would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Because Bruce Lee didn't react the way anyone in that room expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger, or if he did, not a trace of it reached the surface of his face. He didn't issue a challenge out loud, didn't posture, didn't perform. He didn't do any of the visible, predictable, legible things that men in rooms like this one did when someone poked at their pride with public laughter. He got quieter. If you've ever watched real footage of Bruce Lee, and if you haven't, please stop everything after this video, and fix that immediately. You understand exactly what that means. There was a quality to his stillness that was entirely different from the stillness of a man who simply isn't moving. It was the stillness of compression, of potential energy held right at the edge. Like a spring wound all the way down. Like a wave that hasn't broken yet but has already pulled every drop of water away from the shore. The room felt it before anyone could explain it. Because there is something in human beings, something ancient, something animal, something carved into us by millions of years of needing to recognize at the most fundamental level when something genuinely dangerous was about to happen, and that instinct fired in every single person in that room at the exact same moment. The laughter stopped, not because anyone gave a signal, not because anyone consciously decided the joke was over. It just stopped the way sound stops when a window breaks. Sudden, total, replaced by something heavier and more honest than silence. And in that silence, Bruce Lee moved. What happened in the next 10 seconds didn't just shift the atmosphere in a room full of experienced, dangerous, serious men. It changed the way they understood power itself. But before we get there, before we reach those 10 seconds, that moment, the instant the room froze completely, you need to understand something about Bruce Lee that goes much deeper than the movies, deeper than the legend, deeper than the highlight reels and the famous quotes and the stories that have grown larger than any one person should reasonably be able to contain. You need to understand where he came from, because the man standing in that room wasn't born the way he was in that moment. That stillness wasn't natural. That capability wasn't simply a gift handed down by genetics or luck or fate. It was built in the most painful, obsessive, relentless, methodical way imaginable. And that story begins long before this room, long before this laugh, long before the moment the world stopped. It begins with a boy who had everything to prove, and a world that was absolutely determined to make sure he never got the chance to prove it. There is a version of Bruce Lee that the world decided to accept. The movie star, the icon, the man with the nunchucks and the battle cry, and the impossible abs and the lightning-fast kicks that made audiences in theaters across the world collectively lose their minds in a way that no action, hero before or since, has ever quite managed to replicate. That version is real. Those movies are real. The legacy built on those films is real, and it is enormous. and it deserves every ounce of the reverence the world has poured into it across more than half a century. But that version of Bruce Lee is the surface. And if you only know the surface, if that's where your understanding of him begins and ends, then you don't actually know Bruce Lee. You know a projection, a highlight reel, a carefully lit, beautifully composed image of a man standing in the place where his life's work finally met the world's attention. You don't know what it cost. You don't know what was underneath. Lee Junfan was born in San Francisco in 1940, though he would spend the majority of his childhood in Hong Kong. His father was a Cantonese opera singer, which meant the family moved, performed, adapted, and existed in the particular way that performer families do, with enormous amounts of personality and very little of the stable, rooted, predictable kind of life that other children around them seemed to take for granted. From the very beginning, Bruce Lee did not fit neatly into the container the world offered him. He was restless, deeply, uncomfortably, sometimes dangerously restless. He had an energy that couldn't be directed by ordinary channels, not by school, not by routine, not by the quiet social agreements that most children gradually learn to honor. He was quick-tempered, competitive, and almost magnetically drawn toward conflict, in the way that certain kinds of extremely intelligent, extremely physical, extremely underoccupied young people tend to be. Hong Kong in the 1950s was a place where that kind of restlessness had a very specific destination: street gangs. By his early teenage years, Bruce Lee was fighting regularly, not in gyms, not in tournaments, not in any structured environment with rules and referees and anything resembling a safety net. In alleys, on rooftops, in the kind of darkened urban corridors where there are no judges and no rounds and no one to step in when things go further than intended. He won most of those fights. But winning in the street is not the same as being safe. And his parents, watching their son accumulate bruises and enemies and increasingly close calls with consequences that couldn't be walked back, made a decision. They sent him to a martial arts master. The master's name was Ip Man. If you know that name, your pulse probably just ticked upward slightly. If you don't, understand that Ip Man is not simply a figure in Bruce Lee's story. He is one of the most important figures in the entire history of martial arts, a grandmaster of Wing Chun Kung Fu, a man of extraordinary technical precision and philosophical depth, and, as history would eventually quietly confirm, the teacher who handed a violent, restless, brilliant teenage boy the first real key to understanding what he was capable of. Wing Chun is not what most people imagine when they picture Kung Fu. It doesn't look cinematic, at least not at first glance. There are no wide, sweeping movements, no dramatic high kicks, no poses borrowed from the imagery of animals or nature. It is close-range, economical, efficient in the specific way that surgery is efficient. Every single motion stripped back to its pure mechanical purpose, with nothing decorative, nothing wasteful, nothing that exists only to impress. Bruce Lee absorbed it at a rate that made even Ip Man take notice. But absorption wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, because Bruce Lee was not interested in learning a style. He was not interested in mastering a tradition. He was not interested in collecting techniques the way some martial artists collect trophies, impressive to display, but disconnected from any living, breathing, genuinely applicable understanding. He was interested in truth, what actually works, what is real. When all the performance is stripped away, when the tournament points don't matter, and the tradition doesn't matter, and the reputation of the style does not matter, what actually functions when someone is genuinely trying to hurt you? That question would define the rest of his life. He came to America in 1959 at 18 years old, and America was not remotely ready for him. He landed in Seattle, worked in a restaurant to support himself, enrolled in the University of Washington, studied philosophy, and opened a small martial arts school, taught out of garages, out of backyards, out of whatever space he could find for students willing to listen to a young Chinese man explain, with total and complete conviction, that everything they thought they knew about fighting was either incomplete or entirely wrong. He was not always easy about it. Diplomacy was not his strongest early quality. He had a directness that some read as arrogance, a confidence that occasionally crossed into the territory of genuine confrontation, because he wasn't just offering a different perspective, he was challenging the ones already in place. The traditional martial arts community, particularly the established Chinese masters in America, did not appreciate the challenge. There is a story, well documented, widely confirmed, of a formal confrontation that was arranged between Bruce Lee and a representative of those traditional schools. A man named Wang Jackman was sent in 1964 to fight Bruce Lee under specific conditions. If Bruce Lee lost, he was to close his school and stop teaching non-Chinese students. If he won, he was to be left alone to teach whoever he chose. The fight lasted somewhere between 3 minutes and 25 minutes, depending on whose account you read. What is agreed upon by everyone present is the outcome. Bruce Lee won. But more importantly, the fight changed him. Because even in winning, he hadn't been satisfied with how he'd won. It took too long. He'd gotten tired. There were moments where the outcome, clear as it may have seemed afterward, had felt less certain than it should have. And Bruce Lee, this man who was constitutionally incapable of accepting good enough as a final destination, went home after winning and began to tear everything apart. Not just his technique, his entire understanding. What followed was one of the most obsessive, systematic, relentless periods of self-education in the history of combat sports. He studied fencing for its explosive footwork and its understanding of distance and timing. He studied boxing, really studied it, dissecting the mechanics of its greatest practitioners, understanding not just what they did, but why it worked, and exactly how the physics of the human body made those methods more effective than what most traditional martial arts were teaching. He studied wrestling, he studied judo, he studied anatomy and kinesiology and physics. He read everything he could find about the science of human movement and the mechanics of force and the psychology of violence. And while he was reading and studying and analyzing, he was training. The word doesn't quite cover it. What Bruce Lee did in those years wasn't training in any conventional sense. It was more like a sustained, many years-long act of obsession. He trained his hands to the point where his knuckles became instruments rather than body parts. He trained his legs until the kick he could deliver with a single limb-generated forces that testing equipment later struggled to accurately measure. He trained his reaction time, his peripheral vision, his timing, his distance management, his ability to read the body language of another person and translate what he saw into action before the conscious mind had finished forming any kind of thought. He trained his core with a kind of dedicated intensity that bordered on the philosophical. He understood, long before sports science would confirm it in the laboratories decades later, that power in the human body doesn't live in the arms. It lives in the center. It moves outward from there. And if the center was strong, truly and completely strong in the way he intended, then what moved outward from it would be something extraordinary. People who worked out with him in those years didn't talk about it casually. They talked about it the way people talk about witnessing something they weren't entirely sure they should have seen. A 1-inch punch that sent a grown man skidding backward across a floor. A kick that landed before any normal human eye could track its departure. A speed of movement that made experienced martial artists, men who had been training their reflexes their entire adult lives, feel as though they were standing perfectly still. And beneath all of it, beneath the technique and the speed and the power and the obsessive physical preparation, there was a philosophy. This is the part that separates Bruce Lee from every other conversation about fighters, about combat, about physical capability and martial skill. He was not trying to build a better weapon. He was trying to understand truth about movement, about the self, about the nature of conflict and consciousness, and the relationship between the body and the mind when both are pushed past every limit they thought they had. He wrote, extensively, passionately, with the same precision he applied to everything else. He developed a system he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, that was less a style than an anti-style, a philosophy that said, empty yourself of preconception. Do not be bound by method. Take what is useful, discard what is not, add what is specifically and uniquely your own. Water, he said, has no shape of its own. Pour it into a cup and it becomes the cup. Pour it into a bottle and it becomes the bottle. Pour it into a teapot and it becomes the teapot. Be like water. It sounds poetic. It is poetic. But it was also completely literal. He meant it as technical instruction, as a description of how a human body should move through conflict, fluid, adaptive, responsive, without the rigidity of attachment to any particular form or any particular outcome. Most people heard that quote and thought it was a beautiful idea. The people who trained with him understood it was a description of something terrifying. So now go back to that room. Go back to the laughter, to the dismissive glance that moved through the crowd like a tide. To the unspoken consensus of experienced, dangerous men who looked at this quiet, lean, still figure and reached the same effortless conclusion. Too small, they were looking at the surface again. Still asking the wrong question, still measuring weight and wingspan and the raw square footage of a human body as if those numbers were the story. They weren't the story. They were never going to be the story. And in the 10 seconds that were coming, 10 seconds that no one in that room would ever entirely stop thinking about, they were about to learn the difference. The room had already gone quiet. Bruce Lee had already moved. And now everything was about to change. There is a specific kind of silence that is not simply the absence of sound. You felt it before, even if you've never had the language to describe it precisely. It shows up in the moments right before something changes permanently. The second before a car accident that hasn't happened yet, but is no longer avoidable. The held breath at the edge of a diving board. The pause between the last word of an argument and the response that will determine whether the relationship survives it. It is not quiet. It only sounds like quiet. What it actually is attention. Total, collective, involuntary attention. Every person in the room, every nervous system in the building, suddenly and completely pointed in the same direction. Not because anyone chose to look. Because something ancient in each of them forced it. That was the silence in the room when Bruce Lee moved. Let's slow this down. Because 10 seconds, when something real is happening inside them, is not a short period of time. 10 seconds is long enough for the world to rearrange itself. Long enough for every assumption a room full of experienced people held about size and power and danger to come apart at the seams and fall away in pieces. 10 seconds is long enough to learn something you will never, for the rest of your life, be able to unlearn. So let's go through it. Carefully. The way you go through a piece of film when something happens so fast the first time that the eye couldn't catch it. And so you run it back and you slow it down. And you watch it frame by frame until you finally understand what you actually saw. The laughter had barely finished echoing when the energy in Bruce Lee's body shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically. Not in the way that action movies have trained us to expect. No widening of the stance, no theatrical rolling of the shoulders, no narrowing of the eyes into the specific squint that signals to an audience that things are about to get serious. None of that. What shifted was subtler. And because it was subtler, it was more disturbing. To the trained eye, and there were trained eyes in that room, many of them belonging to men who had spent decades learning to read bodies the way other people read faces. What happened in Bruce Lee's physicality in that moment was not the preparation for action. It was the arrival of readiness. There is a difference. Preparation implies a gap between where you are and where you need to be. Readiness implies the gap is already closed. That wherever the moment goes, you are already there ahead of it. That you were there, in fact, before the moment even began. The men in that room who understood what they were seeing felt the hair on the back of their necks rise. The men who didn't understand it would understand it very, very shortly. He crossed the distance between himself and the nearest of the serious, skeptical, laughter-adjacent men in the room in a way that produced its own specific kind of shock. Not because he lunged, not because he exploded forward in the way that aggressive men in confrontational moments typically explode, with obvious, readable, loud intention. He didn't perform the approach, he simply arrived. As though the space between 2 points in the room had quietly renegotiated itself without asking anyone's permission. That was the first thing, the first of the 10 seconds or near enough. And already, the laughter was somewhere else, somewhere far behind the present moment, already belonging to a different version of this room that was fading fast. What he demonstrated next was not a technique in the way the word is usually meant. Technique implies something learned, something applied, something taken from a system and inserted into a moment with craft and intention. What Bruce Lee showed in those seconds was past technique. It was expression. It was the end product of everything described in the years before this room. The training, the obsession, the philosophical dismantling and reconstruction of everything he thought he knew, distilled down to its most pure and honest form. He moved like no one in that room had ever seen a human body move. Not in terms of speed alone, though the speed was real and it was startling, and it landed on every person present with a kind of physical impact, even in the people it never actually touched. But speed alone is something that can be anticipated once you've been around it enough. Speed alone, after sufficient exposure, stops being magic and starts being data that the experienced brain can measure and prepare for. What Bruce Lee had was not just speed, it was the combination. The way the speed moved through a body that was completely, utterly, terrifyingly relaxed. The way there was no telegraph, no preparatory signal, no readable cue, no moment where the body announced what it was about to do before it did it. The way every point of potential motion in his body existed in genuine simultaneous possibility, so that any read of his intention was not merely wrong but impossible, because he hadn't yet chosen his intention himself. He was the living, breathing, physical embodiment of the philosophy he had spent 15 years building. Water taking the shape of the container, no shape until the moment required one. And then instantly, completely, without negotiation, that shape. The man closest to him felt it before he could see it. That's the part that broke people, not the watching, the feeling. There is a pressure that genuine speed generates in the air around a body, a displacement, a sensation that the nervous system processes before the eyes have finished sending their message to the brain. And in the moment that Bruce Lee moved, the men nearest to him felt that pressure change, felt the air itself shift, and their bodies responded to it before any conscious thought could form. Hands came up, not as defenses, not as anything strategic, as reflex, pure and involuntary. The oldest protection the human animal has, reaching back past everything learned, past every technique trained into muscle memory, all the way to the most primal level of what a body does when it registers incoming threat. It cannot process fast enough to address with intention. They flinched. Trained fighters, experienced men, people who had spent their careers learning to not flinch, flinched. He didn't hurt anyone. That is worth being absolutely clear about. This was not a moment of violence. It was a moment of demonstration, of proof. And the proof was delivered with the specific surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how much was necessary and had no interest whatsoever in excess. A strike pulled back at the last fraction of an inch. A movement completed so fully and so cleanly that the man on its receiving end understood with total physical certainty exactly what had been chosen not to happen. That is a different kind of power than impact. Impact can be explained away. Impact can be attributed to lucky angles and favorable distances and 100 small variables that the bruised ego will always find a way to argue with. But the thing Bruce Lee delivered in those 10 seconds was not impact. It was understanding. And understanding cannot be argued with. It lands somewhere deeper than the ego can reach. It goes straight past every story you've been telling yourself about how things work and installs itself, quietly and permanently, in the place where truth lives. Now let's talk about Tyson, because this is the part that matters most. This is the part that separates this story from every other story about Bruce Lee's speed and Bruce Lee's power and the various rooms and arenas and gymnasiums where serious people underestimated him and then stopped underestimating him in a way they never recovered from. What makes this story different is who was in the room. Mike Tyson was not an ordinary observer. He was not a casual fan, not a curious outsider, not someone whose opinion about fighting was built on movies and assumptions and a comfortable distance from the real thing. He was the most dangerous combat athlete on the planet. His eye for physical capability was not simply good. It was among the finest that had ever existed in any human being who had ever watched another human being move in the context of violence. He could see things that other people couldn't see. That was part of his genius. It was never just the physical gifts, as extraordinary as those were. It was the understanding, the read. The ability to assess threat and capability and timing with an accuracy that bordered on the uncanny. And in those 10 seconds, Mike Tyson saw something he would spend years afterward struggling to put into words that felt adequate. Something that the famous recorded conversation between him and various interviewers would return to repeatedly across decades. Tyson circling the same idea from different angles, trying to land on the description that finally did it justice, never quite satisfied that any version of it was enough. What he saw was someone who was faster than him. Let that sit for a moment. Because it is not a sentence that Mike Tyson produced easily or casually or without the full weight of what it meant behind it. This was a man who had outrun the reflexes of every heavyweight who ever stepped into a ring with him. A man whose hands were, by the measurement of people whose job it was to measure such things, among the fastest ever recorded in his division. And he watched Bruce Lee move and saw, with the unsparing clarity of someone who had no reason to lie to himself about these things, that this quiet, lean, impossibly still man was operating at a level of speed that he, Iron Mike, could not claim to match. The room was not just frozen now, the room was reconstructed. Everything that had been true in it 5 minutes earlier was true in a different way. The hierarchy that the assembled people had casually assumed based on size and weight and reputation and the comfortable categories of the world they lived in, that hierarchy had been lifted out, turned over and set back down in a shape no one had anticipated. The laughter was gone. There was no trace of it anywhere in the room. It hadn't faded gradually. It had not completed itself and simply ended the way laughter normally ends. It had stopped as though it had never existed, as though the room collectively understood that producing it in the first place had been a form of error so significant that the only appropriate response was to let no evidence of it survive. No one met anyone else's eyes, because meeting eyes in that moment would require acknowledging what everyone in the room was now privately, individually, and permanently holding. They had been wrong. Not about a small thing, not about a detail, about the central question, about what danger looked like, about what power meant, about which variables actually determined the outcome of a confrontation between two human bodies in a moment of absolute truth. They had been wrong in the specific way that intelligent, experienced, confident people are wrong, which is the most instructive kind of wrong there is. Not through ignorance, not through carelessness, through assumption, through the perfectly understandable but completely fatal mistake of believing that what you have seen before is sufficient preparations for what you are about to see. It is never sufficient a preparation for something genuinely new. And Bruce Lee, standing in the center of a frozen room, perfectly still again, completely calm, with that particular quality of quietness that the room now understood was not simply peace but confidence at a depth they had no previous framework to measure, was something genuinely new, had always been, would always be. Here is something that the world rarely talks about when it talks about greatness. What comes after the moment? We love the moment itself. We love the freeze frame, the room going silent, the jaws dropping, the hierarchy shifting, the assumptions collapsing. We love that part because it's clean, because it has a shape, because it fits neatly inside the kind of story we already know how to feel something about. But what happens after? What does a moment like that leave in the people who witnessed it? What does it deposit into the ongoing life of a man like Mike Tyson, a man who built his entire existence around the architecture of physical dominance, when he watches someone walk into a room and quietly dismantle everything that architecture was built on? That is the part that goes deeper than the story. That is the part we need to talk about now. In the years that followed, and this is documented publicly across multiple interviews and recorded conversations that anyone with an internet connection can find within 60 seconds, Mike Tyson spoke about Bruce Lee with a reverence that he reserved for almost no one else. Not for other fighters, not for other athletes, not for champions or legends or the celebrated giants of combat sports, whose names appeared beside his own in the historical conversations about the greatest of all time. For Bruce Lee, specifically and repeatedly, and with a quality of feeling in his voice that people who study Tyson's public persona will recognize immediately as something rare, a kind of awe that had no performance in it. No strategy, no brand management, no carefully calculated generosity extended toward a safe and deceased legend for the sake of a story that made him look magnanimous, genuine awe. The kind that happens to a person involuntarily and stays with them the way certain experiences stay, not as memory exactly, but as a permanent recalibration of how you understand the world. Tyson said, in terms that shifted slightly across different tellings, but maintained the same essential core, that Bruce Lee was the most impressive physical specimen he had ever encountered, that the speed he possessed was unlike anything Tyson had experienced in any other context, that watching him move was like watching something operate by a different set of rules than the ones everyone else was using. He said, and this is the part that lands differently when you fully understand what it means, coming from that particular source, that Bruce Lee frightened him. Not frightened in the way of a man admitting weakness, frightened in the way of a man with an extraordinarily precise and honest read of danger, admitting that his instrument had registered something at the absolute upper end of its range. The way a seismograph doesn't feel fear, but nevertheless tells you clearly and without editorial that what just moved through it was extraordinary. Mike Tyson's fear was his highest compliment. It was also his most honest measurement, and he gave it fully and without reservation to a man who weighed 135 pounds. Think about what that tells us. Not about Bruce Lee specifically, though it tells us a great deal about him. Think about what it tells us about the nature of capability itself, about the fundamental error that human beings make repeatedly and across every domain of life when they allow surface measurements to substitute for genuine understanding. We do it constantly. We do it instinctively, almost helplessly, because the brain is an efficiency machine and visible, immediate measurements are easy and quick and feel reliable. Tall or short, heavy or light, loud or quiet, impressive or ordinary. The brain reaches for these measurements because they cost nothing to take and have been useful enough in enough situations that the habit of taking them has become essentially automatic. But Bruce Lee's entire life was a demonstration of what those measurements miss. Every room he ever walked into that went quiet with dismissal, every laugh, every sideways glance, every unspoken consensus that this particular person did not belong in this particular conversation, was another data point in the same relentless proof. The proof that the most significant things about any human being are not and have never been the things you can see from across the room in the first 5 seconds of looking. They are the things built in private, in the years of work that no one witnessed, in the decisions made before dawn and after midnight when no audience was present, and the only thing compelling the person forward was their own absolute, uncompromising refusal to stop. That is the room that actually matters, the room no one sees. The room where Tyson stopped laughing, where the real, interior version of that moment played out, is not the physical room where Bruce Lee demonstrated something astonishing. It is the room inside every person who understood what they had witnessed and then had to go home and figure out what to do with that understanding. Bruce Lee died in 1973 at 32 years old. 32. Let that number find its proper weight in you for a moment. 32 years old. There are athletes still figuring out their prime at 32. There are artists who haven't produced their defining work yet at 32. There are people who haven't quite found the direction their life is going to take at 32, which is fine, which is human, which is the completely ordinary reality of a lifespan that most of us are fortunate enough to have time to navigate at whatever pace it actually takes. Bruce Lee had, by 32, already done everything. He had rebuilt the philosophy of combat from the ground up. He had created a system of movement that martial arts and combat sports are still borrowing from today, still discovering, still integrating, still finding new depths in, more than 50 years after he put it into the world. He had changed the way an entire global audience understood what the human body was capable of. He had walked into rooms full of the most formidable people on the planet and made them feel, in 10 seconds or less, something they had genuinely never felt before. And in the work he left behind, the writings, the interviews, the footage, the philosophy, he deposited something that has not diminished with time, something that continues to arrive in people's lives at the exact moment they are most prepared to receive it, which is perhaps the truest measure of whether an idea has real value. The ideas that find you at the right time. Here is what I want you to take from this, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Every single person watching this video right now lives in some version of that room. Maybe not literally. Maybe the room is a classroom where someone's hand gets overlooked one too many times. Maybe it's a workplace where the loudest voice gets the credit and the quietest voice keeps generating the ideas. Maybe it's a creative space, an athletic space, a social space, any environment where visible, immediate, easily measured qualities get rewarded, and the things built in private, built slowly, built in the dark years before anyone was paying attention, don't register on the instruments the room is using to take its measurements. You know that feeling. The laugh doesn't always sound like a laugh. Sometimes it sounds like a rejection letter. Sometimes it sounds like a passed over promotion. Sometimes it sounds like the comfortable silence of a room that simply doesn't look up when you walk into it. The question is not whether the laugh comes. It will come. It comes for almost everyone who is building something real, because real things are almost always invisible until the moment they aren't, and the gap between invisible and undeniable is exactly the period when the laughter is loudest. The question is what you do inside that gap. Do you let the laugh reshape you? Do you start building yourself in the image of what the room respects rather than what you know to be true? Do you trade the quiet, obsessive, honest work of becoming something real for the louder, more immediately rewarded performance of appearing impressive to people who are asking the wrong questions? Or do you get quieter? Do you compress? Do you go back to the private room, the room before dawn, the room after midnight, the room where no one is watching and the only thing that exists is you and the work, and the best distance between who you are and who you are becoming? And do you keep building? Bruce Lee chose the private room every single day. For years before anyone knew his name, for years before any stage or screen or gymnasium gave him the chance to show what those private years had produced. He chose it when the traditional martial arts community told him he didn't belong. He chose it when the film industry told him there was no audience for what he was. He chose it when rooms full of dangerous men looked at his size and reached their comfortable, confident, completely mistaken conclusion. He went back to the room. He got quieter. He compressed. And then, when the moment came, as it always comes eventually for people who do not stop, he moved. In 10 seconds. In the frozen silence of a room that had been laughing 5 minutes earlier. In the wide, unblinking, recalibrating eyes of a man who would go on to become the most feared heavyweight in boxing history. He moved and proved, for the 10,000th time, the thing he had always known and spent his entire life demonstrating, that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the loudest thing, or the largest thing, or the most immediately obvious thing. It is the thing that has been built in private, that has been tested in the dark, that has no need to announce itself, because it has long since moved past the need for anyone's permission to be real. It is the thing that was never performing in the first place. The room froze. It always freezes eventually for the people who do the work. The only question left, the only question that was ever actually worth asking in the first place, is whether you'll still be in the room when it does. If this video made you think about something differently today, you already know what to do. Don't just watch. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere right now, someone is in a room full of laughter, deciding whether to stay or leave. Help them stay.